Hi guys, this week we're going to look at geometric design and we're going to break down in a forensic study of how geometrics are put together. So if we look at geometrics, almost any geometric design, they're typically broken into three possible core shapes: a square or a rectangle, rotated square or rectangle that's a diamond, sometimes skewed slightly to become a parallelogram, or a hexagon. Hexagons, tile, as you've seen in beehives. Diamonds and squares often make grids. Well, they always make grids. But they also form the basis for more complicated geometric designs that the repeat isn't always obvious. So in this case, you'll see this non-iconoclastic Arabic design motif where it actually is at its core repeat that's a square with more complicated shapes that repeat out to the corners and to the center. So your goal is really to try and find that core unit and build off of that. Here's a more complicated version of one of those where you can see the square contains overlapping shapes that interconnect across the boundaries of the square to make more shapes. So in this particular case, you see this set of really complicated star shapes in the center. That's really just the interconnecting points of the four corners or the centers of the squares. How do you do that? Think about symmetry when you're designing and start with a square and make sure you use guides and always go to the middle or to the thirds or pick up across the design motif like you've done in your tossed repeat patterns. So here's a log cabin. This is a log cabin motif, and it's a popular quilt motif. And so if you think about the motifs individually as maybe a little more complex systems, you want to then understand how they are repeatable. So this one is just interlocking, overlapping, dark and light rectangles that get consistently bigger based on the width of the last piece. All the dark ones are on one half at a diagonal, and so on. And when you put this thing into different arrangements, it makes totally different patterns. And that's really what we're looking for with your geometrics. Can the motifs make different types of patterns as they are set into repeat? That's your challenge. So you can see with the log cabin quilt, the basic motif, the square here, as it's arranged, it will make things like stripes or chevrons, etc. And in this animation that my team created years ago for the Quilt Museum, you'll see lots of different pattern orientations simply by rotating that one motif. So if you make a motif that works on a diagonal, like a log cabin, you can do stripes with it, zigzags, chevrons, etc. There's, I think, 16 or 18 different orientations you can actually do in this particular pattern to create even more complex ones that I've pictured here in the PowerPoint. So it all goes back to, for this particular motif, the square. Other motifs are also based on squares and rectangles. Things like this is an oji. And what you may never notice is that this curve right here is a reciprocal curve to this. So just like our other design units, this shape can be repeated up in the opposite corners, and then it will create the oji pattern repeat. Same thing with this one. This is called a quatrefoil, and you've seen quatrefoils before. The same premise, just a different organization of the shapes or the lines. And here, if you get things symmetrically lined up the way I described earlier, that if you get the dead center on a square, you can pretty much make any shape, and as long as it's reciprocated on the corners, so in other words, this one's copied up to this corner and rotated, and then set into repeat, you can make this thing repeat. You can also use a larger gap around the outside, and as long as it's equidistant, you can create different orientations of this particular pattern. Also the hexagon. Let's look at that one because it in itself will create really interesting overlaps. And something like this, you see the hexagon overlapping. However, if you were to set this into repeat, you would need to overlap it, and you would then also need to somehow incorporate the star. So really, in effect, you need to make the simple hexagon shape first, create overlaps or copies of that shape, and then use the shape builder tool in Illustrator to cut away those extra shapes so that you have what's left over, a hexagon with remnants of overlapping nearby hexagons. Also, you can dissect a hexagon using parallelograms or diamonds, right? So a diamond here is really just, made of a diamond, or sorry, the hexagon is made up of diamonds, where the shapes are parallel, or the lines are parallel to one another, and they are the same length, right? When you organize those in this particular setup, you get what is called an isometric grid. Meaning that the angles of this equal 66 and a half, 33 and a half, 0, and or 180 degrees. So in this setup, you would not ever have a 90-degree angle, something that goes up or down. So you either have 33, 66, or a 180, or a 0. So when you set up a diamond in the corner of a hexagon, you can then break it out, add parallel lines to it, and create what looks like a cube on its side. You can erase certain lines and add certain lines to make it look more like a cube. And you can use that same premise to make designs that look like this, where it actually just starts off as a hexagon, but for some people it looks like arrows, for other people it looks like a dissected cube. So as you're working on this project, I want you to pay attention to a few things. You're going to make 3 different patterns, and you're not limited to those, because once you start going on this, you'll have lots of different ways to do it. There's certain vocabulary terms we want to look at. For example, tessellating shapes. You don't have to use tessellations, but you can, and that's where shapes, as I described, that are portioned out into the corners, tessellate or interlock with one another. An OG pattern is this type of pattern. A quatrefoil is one that I've shown you here. A damask is also a geometric pattern, but just employs more ornamental motifs. Hexagon block, houndstooth, which is actually a form of a tessellation. Shell patterns, which is another type of tessellation as well. In here, you can look at this Instagram guide. And I created this Instagram guide based on infinite scrolling and death scrolling that I do on Instagram Reels, and I find these all the time. And these are different ways to create motifs. They are ways to make patterns, but there are limitations to the different patterns that you can make. So using the traditional method of making patterns in Illustrator sometimes is gives you a little bit more control. So for example, here in this one, I think it shows you how to create the initial motif and then how to set it into repeat. So you can just follow along to get some ideas here, slow it down, watch what they do, and see how it goes for you. But the Illustrator has this newer tool, which is really great. I love it. And it's for making patterns in this particular case, also making motifs. So an object, using the repeat grid method. So here is your object. You made a quatrefoil shape, and then you can set it into a grid repeat, and it will fill or create a fill for your object. Object, repeat radial, and you can get these amazing looking radials. Object, repeat grid here. It's good for making different pattern layouts with more complex designs. So these are good for quick repeats. These are good for developing motifs, and these are good for creating more complicated systems. So I also want you to look at this geometric pattern design library, and this is just like the best thing I have found on Pinterest. So go through all that and then go in and check it out. There's like literally hundreds of geometric designs in here to hopefully inspire you a little bit. Lastly, watch these 3 videos. They're not particularly long, but they will give you some of the mechanics on how to make things, such as a scale pattern or an ECOT pattern. You don't have to do yours that are inspired by R2D2. And if I do reference that in the video, just watch it for how to actually make geometrics. So these are just 3 videos that show you the actual pattern making tools in Illustrator. Remember, you're going to make 3 different geometric patterns using your color library. So all of your patterns to date have been tied together, hopefully by the same color library or color pattern. And good luck with this project. Ping me if you need some help, and look forward to seeing the results you come up with.